Great. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming back. Well, sometimes people don't always come back. They get a break. They go. They take a nap. They're done. This second part of my talk really is kind of the dispatches from the field part. And if I haven't learned anything else in the time that I've been here with you all, it's that the landscape on which you are living is different from the landscape on which I am living. And so at this weird time in the life of the United States, I just want to give you kind of, I guess, a heads up about how some of us are feeling and what some of us feel like we want to do. And what some of us think all people of liberal faith should find some way of engaging in. And what I tell my folks is that our goal is to be a small part of the great work. And we don't need to do every part of that work. We need to find our part of it and enter into it with energy and with joy. We don't have to do everything, but we can do something. And the thing that we can do, we should do. That's a famous quote, although I can't remember who said it right this minute. Václav Havel, the former president of the Czech Republic, is the author of a book called Summer Meditations. And in it he wrote something that really circles in my head periodically since I first read it. And for me, he's talking about a struggle that is very present and immediate for me, and that's the struggle between good and evil. And he wrote these words. It is an eternal, never-ending struggle, waged not just by people who think about the world and eternity against those who think only of themselves and the moment. It takes place inside everyone. It is what makes a person and life, life. That had a lot of resonance for me. I am a child of the 60s, and by that I really mean I was a child in the 1960s. I grew up in the middle of all the enormous upheavals that occurred in the United States at that time, especially as it relates to women and people of color. And there's no part of my life that hasn't been touched and shaped by the events at that time. And if I don't know anything else in the whole world, I know this thing. Nothing that I am and nothing that I have could have happened without that struggle and that set of struggles in the United States. I'm standing here today because of those arguments. I know what I know, and I do what I do, and I believe what I believe because people I never even met more than a half century ago had an idea and a vision about what the United States could be like and should be like, and they were willing to act on what they thought and believed and fight for what they thought and believed. And some of them were willing to die for what they believed, and some of them did. And for those of you who don't have a clear glimpse of what's going on in the United States, there is a growing sense among many of us that all that work and all that struggle and all those accomplishments of that time are in great danger, great jeopardy. So many of us believe that there is a great world struggle going on right now between good and evil. There's nothing complicated about it for me. And that's not true, because life is always complicated, and there are always layers of things, to be honest. And it's a struggle that has more layers in the United States than it might have in other parts of the world. But it's still about some of the same things that have always plagued us as human beings. It's still about money. It's still about power. It's still about who's in. It's still about who's out. It's still about what human beings need and deserve in order to live. It's still about who makes the decisions about what that is. But for those of us who are enmeshed in the synergy that is race and class and gender in the United States, it feels especially weird and threatening right now. There is this resurgence of virulent racism and misogyny and a deep scorn and disdain and even hatred for the poor and for people who don't have as much as other people. But it did all those things, that resurgence, I don't believe happened because the earlier struggles were a failure. I actually think that the energy behind all of this hatred comes in part from that struggle and how successful it actually was. In the brief window that was the 60s and the 70s, for example, there was a huge rise in the black working and middle class. People who never thought of going to college were suddenly going there and building careers and lives and breaking down barriers. I'm the daughter of sharecroppers. I was the first person in my family to finish grade school. I was the first to go to college. My brother was the first one to get his master's degree because he went to school, and I was done with school by the time I got out. I couldn't take it anymore, so it was years before I went back and got my master's degree, so I'm the second one. And it's important to recognize that what seemed like success for us, what seemed like living into the American dream as we were taught that we were supposed to do, was not success for everybody. And by that I mean that wasn't what was supposed to happen. We weren't supposed to do those things. I wasn't supposed to happen. My family's trajectory was not supposed to happen. The current president of the United States was not supposed to happen. None of that was supposed to happen. Hillary Clinton wasn't supposed to happen. And the more I think about it, and the more that a lot of us think about it, the more we begin to understand how large a group of people feel offended that it happened, and how determined they are that it never happen again. That it never happen again. I think that that's the reason that there has been this incredible assault on poor people. Yesterday, the food stamp cuts went into effect. And there will be hundreds of thousands of people who will not have food. Before I left, I went to Trader Joe's, which is a local store in New York. Some of you, it's new to New York, relatively. We always did Fairway and stuff like that. But it has its origins in California, so for those of you who grew up in California, you all knew Trader Joe's. But I went and bought $300 worth of Trader Joe gift cards and gave them to our office manager. Because I know that sooner or later, in the next few weeks and months, somebody's going to be ringing the bell and asking for food or money. That's kind of commonplace in an urban congregation. At first, it was transportation. So we have a little kit that we now give people who come to the door. Because we don't give cash, but we do give Metro cards. We give a couple of Metro cards so people can ride back and forth to where they need to go. We give something called street sheets, which another religious group puts together. It's all of the resources in all 5 boroughs of New York about where you can eat, where you can sleep, where you could change your clothes and take a shower, where you might look for a job, where you could use a computer to do your resume and get your mail. Where you could get medical care or dental care. And they do it by borough, and it's just sheets with information on them, and they update them every month to the best of their ability. So we give them a little envelope with the food card, with the Metro card, and the street sheets, and hope that it will tide them over. It's not perfect. But there's a part of me that resents it all. I resent it. I resent having to assemble little envelopes for human beings so that they can eat. And yes, I know that there are people who are scamming the system. I know that all the time. There always are people who scam the system. But as a person who considers herself a follower of Jesus, I can't worry about that. It's not my job to figure out who's lying to me and who's telling me the truth about what they need and want. It's my job to do what I can to provide it. I can't do everything. I can't feed everybody. I can't house everybody. But if you ring my bell at church, then I can do that one small thing. It's not an accident that they're cutting student loans. Even the capacity to get a student loan has shifted. It's not an accident that there is a prison industrial complex in the United States that arrests people It puts them in jail for nonviolent offenses at a rate that's completely out of control. And when you consider that once you have an arrest conviction, you can't vote. Once you have an arrest conviction, in many states you can't vote. In no state can you get a loan to go to school anymore. You can't get a loan to go to college if you have a conviction. So people who make one mistake are doomed to a life where that mistake haunts them forever. That is not a religious response to anything. But that's what it's like in America right now. The scorn about being poor, the idea that it's your fault, the idea that you obviously didn't have the appropriate values that made it possible for you to succeed. You obviously thought that the government was here to give you a handout. And encoded within this profoundly racist code that translates well to people who want to hear it and is painful for those of us who don't want to hear it. All those things are going on right now. And I think that as a result, there is a profound anger and frustration that has begun to grow among people of faith and among people who don't have any particular faith. The Occupy Wall Street movement, in large part, began in the wake of the incredible near collapse of the United States financial system and the fact that not one single person has seen one moment of jail time. Not one. They're still making deals with J.P. Morgan Chase about how much money they can settle their lawsuit against them. The U.S. Justice Department has a lawsuit against J.P. Morgan Chase, and they're still working out the details in the hope of avoiding criminal charges. And right now I think it's up to about $13 billion as a settlement, which isn't going to begin to cover the number of people who lost everything. The homes that they lost, the livelihoods that they lost, the savings, the pensions, all those things. But all those people who helped do it are still happily moving along in their lives. If it were not for the new senator from Massachusetts, Elizabeth Warren, nobody would have anything intelligent to say about this in public. She's the only person that at hearings has said, is there a reason we shouldn't have you arrested and put in jail? Well, but not enough. It's not enough. And so there's this sense, there's a part of this that's hopeless, that feels hopeless to a lot of people. There's a part of it that feels overwhelming to a lot of people. When you consider how much money got spent to defeat Barack Obama in the previous election cycle, and how much of it came from people who had a vested interest in oppressing some or perhaps all of the groups that I've just talked about. The Koch brothers, who have spent hundreds of millions of dollars to influence elections in key states, who have spent hundreds of millions of dollars to influence elections on the state level, so that legislatures can begin to undo democracy locally. Literally dismantle it. The biggest two examples I have are, one, what's going on in North Carolina right now. North Carolina is the seat of a genuine democratic struggle. Small d democratic struggle. Because one perfect example, when the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act and overturned Section 4, where people had to get approval in states that had shown a pattern of discrimination about any changes that they would make in the law, that was on Tuesday. On Friday, North Carolina had passed and placed on the governor's signature on his desk for a signature, a law that completely reversed the accomplishments of a generation of voting rights activists. ID laws that were pernicious and practically unenforceable, that they estimate will diminish the amount of, or the number of voters by hundreds of thousands because they don't have the appropriate ID. An end to early voting, the end to voting on Sunday. All of which are designed to target particular groups of people who've exercised the democratic process, especially African American voters, who for the first time in this presidential election voted at higher rates than whites. There are people who are very frightened by that information. There are people who are very frightened by the idea that by the year 2050, America, the United States of America, will be a country with no particular racial or ethnic majority. There will be no majority group. That's bad news for a lot of people, and they do not intend to go gently. And they've connected this particular virulent set of ideas with returning America to its true nature as a Christian country, which every Unitarian Universalist from the age of 6 knows is not true. We know enough. When we don't teach our kids anything else, we teach our kids who the Unitarian Universalists were, who helped to begin the United States of America. We don't lie to them about Jefferson. We don't make up stories about what they said about this country. We don't have people like David Barton, who is a profoundly right-wing Christian so-called historian, who provides video lessons for homeschoolers in the conservative Christian movement that focuses on a warped sense of history, that denies anything that we know and have learned in school, and insists that our nation is a Christian nation. I'm angry, and I'm not by myself. I'm angry because I believe that our democracy, our very imperfect system of governance, it's not like America's always been a hero here, but we have made attempts. Our vote, all the things that we complain about in the United States but that we really love, all those things are in terrible danger. As people of faith, I believe that we have a solemn responsibility to speak and to act in defense of the system that we love and the country that we love and the faith that we love. Not only for our own faith, but on behalf of other people whose faiths do not confine themselves to these little narrow boxes that a very small group of people want to place everybody in. The threat that faces us is not Al-Qaeda. The threat that faces us is not the Muslim Brotherhood. It's not the Taliban. It's not any of the people who are supposed to be the usual suspects that we're all supposed to be running away from and being afraid. The creeping rot that is undermining our democracy and our faith is within. And our country's leadership is being overrun by a very small group of partisan, deliberately hateful, willfully ignorant, anti-democratic people who are determined to destroy the structure of the country and replace it with a theocracy. And I believe that they have to be stopped. I'm not even remotely ambivalent about that. And the strength that we need to stop them, the strength that we need to resist this kind of stealth tyranny which affects us. Because it's not like they're going to announce, oh, we're going to take over the country. Look, it's all being done very calmly, very earnestly, because they love America. And they want to restore America to its greatness. By which they really mean they want to make sure that white land-owning men, once again, are the only people who have anything to say in the United States about how our lives are governed. That's what they mean. And some of them, if you catch them on a bad day, they'll tell you. Catch them on the right website, they'll tell you. Rand Paul's organizer used to write columns on his website about how slavery wasn't really a bad idea. And the idea that we could still be living in a world where people still want to have a conversation about why the enslavement of African Americans wasn't so bad should tell you how dangerous people have become. That's not even a conversation to have, but people are having it. Not big groups of people that we know about, but people are having them. There was an article in Salon magazine online about whether or not the Tea Party was really racist. And that's it was a very short article. Whoever said that is true. But what was so interesting about the article was that they decided that they would go to racist websites and see what racist websites were saying. And the most famous racist website in the United States is something called Stormfront. It's where the white supremacist folks and our Posse Comitatus and the Order and the Aryan Nation, all those people kind of hang out. And they have a whole thread on Tea Party. And the two parts of the debate, as it was related to us when you read the story, is one, the Tea Party aren't nearly racist enough. They're basically punks, right? And the Tea Party is an excellent opportunity for us to recruit. And one guy was talking about how he made it a point to go to Tea Party rallies and events to recruit people to white supremacist work. And that he had been pretty successful in that in Colorado. I think it was Colorado. I could be wrong about the state, but I believe it was Colorado.
Ken Buck.
I'm sorry?
Ken Buck.
Yeah, that's right, Ken Buck. Okay, so it shouldn't surprise you, but you can't help but feel like, wait a minute, I didn't sign up for this. I thought we were done with this. But we're not done. We're not done. And so our strength to resist lies in the principles and the sources of liberal faith and in the level of trust that we have always placed in the wisdom of informed and gathered communities like this one. The practices of our faith, transparency, the affirmation of other people who are different from ourselves with a need and a desire to understand them, our openness to truth, even when it's uncomfortable or difficult. These are the practices that prepare us for life in a community. And when gathered community is at work like this, we call it a congregation. That's how we function in congregational life. You believe one thing, I believe something else. We affirm a common set of values, and we live into a common future. When such a gathered community is at work in the world, we think of it as democracy. What all these groups share is the promises that we make to one another, promises that are rooted in the common good, promises that are supported by faith traditions across the world and across time. But we in the United States right now are faced with a culture that no longer has consensus on what the common good is. It's given way in some way to this heartless anarchy of self-interest. If you didn't take care of yourself enough to get a retirement, that's too bad. If you don't have health care, go ahead and die. And anybody who doesn't believe me should go on YouTube and find one of the presidential debates where somebody asked the question and people said, well, they'll just die, and there was applause. There was applause. I am not telling you that everybody in America feels like this. Because everybody in America does not feel like this. But I'm telling you that there are conversations going on in America right now that our generation of people believed was absolutely impossible to have and unthinkable to imagine. It would never have occurred to me in my life that people would think it was okay to let somebody die because they didn't have health insurance. Never entered my mind until the last few years. When enough people in society delude themselves into thinking that there is no such thing as the interconnected web of all existence of which we are a part, that's a value that we affirm. It's important to us. It's not new in the culture, but it's important to us. Dr. King talked about a mutual garment of destiny, that we were interrelated. There's truth in that. We know there's truth in that. But we have a society of people who have denied that. When you have enough money to insulate yourself from the reality of struggle, you can come up with anything. I live in New York City. We are about to get rid of a mayor who is a billionaire. And one of the things he has said recently as he's on his way out is that the affordable housing shortage in New York, which is significant, so significant that people can't afford to stay in New York and move away, is a good thing because it means people want to live here. Well, that's great if they can figure out how. He thinks that what we need in New York are more billionaires because billionaires are job creators. It's been a long time since I got a job from a billionaire. I can't speak for you. But if the mayor of the largest city in the United States thinks that the affordable housing crisis in New York is a success, is a successful sign, it gives you an example of how skewered money and power has made our culture. So in this new world of strategy and spin, we've lost the capacity to talk about right and wrong. We've lost the capacity to talk about good or evil. And I feel like it's up to those of us who are faithful people to call out and say what we see. The misery that we are experiencing, or that many people are experiencing in the United States and around the world, really is evil. That's structural evil. The positions that many of our politicians hold are anti-human. Their tactics are anti-democratic. There is a law in Michigan about the Emergency Powers Act that allows the governor to declare a community or a town as under emergency management, to throw out every duly elected official in that town and to replace them with an appointed person who will make appropriate financial decisions for that town. Now, it shouldn't come as any surprise to anyone that at least 50% of the towns in Michigan where this law has been exercised is a predominantly African American community. And I've actually had conversations with a couple of my friends within the UUA to talk about why it is that we have not been more vocal about these issues. Because anything that is that blatantly an affront to the democratic process is our business. It's our business as people of faith. And it's our business as people who are citizens of a country that we love. And who, for all its faults and all its issues, still has roots in the democratic process that we value. So that's why I say we're at war. This war of culture and values that's been going on about 20 or 30 years, I think has gotten stronger in part because it's a last gasp effort. Demographically, this can't be sustained. So if they don't win now, they won't win at all, and that's why they're working so very hard at it on so many fronts. At the very notion that, or the very moment that I was talking about this in my own congregation a couple of weeks ago, there was being held the Voters' Values Summit in another part of the country, as though the only people who had any values were the people who were assembled at their conference. Michelle Bachmann, Rick Santorum, Rand Paul, all the people who have a very different idea about what democracy looks like. We're all gathered together to talk about what was wrong with us. And I know that we hate these dichotomies. We are Unitarian after all. So we believe in the unity of things. We don't like to think about ourselves playing against something, struggling against something. We would prefer to be in dialogue and conversation. It is our preferred mode of work. But I do not believe that dialogue is going to be enough. I really don't. I believe that faith is our antidote to fundamentalism. I believe that faith in the possibility that is inherent in human beings. I believe in a faith that talks about the goodness of life itself. Faith in God or a power greater than ourselves. Faith in democracy, in the democratic process. The power of the people to know one another, to love one another, to govern themselves. We need to renew our faith in those things and act as if we were renewed in them. Fundamentalists of every kind count on our cynicism and our bitterness and our apathy and our hopelessness. Feeling overwhelmed that we can't possibly fight against people with that much money and that much influence and that much power. We can't allow ourselves to be seduced by that. Fundamentalism of every kind is our greatest single threat. And it doesn't matter if it's fundamentalism that's religious. It doesn't matter if it's economic fundamentalism that thinks that the market will take care of everything if we just let it run wild. It doesn't matter if it's political fundamentalism that believes that all is fair in love and war and politics as long as we can pay for it. It's fundamentalism that is our enemy. It's fundamentalism that is eating at our lives and destroying our country and its possibilities. It's fundamentalism that is leading America down a path that will have global implications. As I was saying earlier, if you have people like Ted Cruz, whose father is a dominionist minister who believes that the end times are upon us, who believes that it's God's will that his son be president. If you have people like that who are being taken seriously in the halls of government, it's not enough to be unhappy. It's not enough to be concerned. We have a responsibility to act. I'm a sucker for lists. I like to make them. I like to read them. I'm one of those people who stands at the newsstand just to read the list of the 5 fashion tips that I need to know right now, even though I can't afford any of the things that are in the magazine for me to buy. Some of that's because of my previous career. I used to be a magazine writer and editor, and I learned to write those cover lines a long time ago. That's what we call them. Because they're meant to grab your attention. 15 ways to cook chicken, or whatever it is. They're meant to, you're told that one of the things you need to use is numbers. The other thing that I love is teaching. I love teaching Unitarian Universalists who are seminarians. I love teaching them about their history and about the great tradition in which they stand. And I think a lot about what they will need to be ministers in the world in which we live. And I think that one of the most important things a minister needs in training right now is a good congregation. Good people to match them in the work that they do. Ministers have a fair amount of power in any given congregation, but they don't have enough power to make people do anything that they don't really want to do. It's a partnership. That's as it should be. So, good ministers occur in part because there are good congregations working with them. And because I'm the directive sort, I happen to have a set of ideas about what I think it makes a good congregation. Which I told my own congregation about last week. But I wanted to share them with you because I think good UUs are the biggest protection, one of the biggest protections that we have against the kind of horror that will face us if we do not stop some of this behavior by people who really think that we're not important enough to be bothered with. There's a level of contempt at the core of these activities that I find particularly offensive. That we, the people, are not smart enough to govern ourselves, are not worthy of the responsibility of democracy. I find that especially evil. And I don't feel like rolling over for it. And a lot of our people in our liberal religious congregations don't feel like that either. But you can't do that kind of work without being strengthened yourselves. Because social justice work, the work of democracy, the work of liberal religion is exhausting unless you have foundations for yourselves. So, in keeping with my list of things that I think people ought to know, I want to talk about the 10 things I think good Unitarian Universalists already know. It's my hope here that I'm only reminding you of things, not telling you things you've never heard in your whole life. I think that, first of all, good UUs know that we are people of the covenant, not of the creed, that our community, that our common life are only as good and as rich and as full as the promises that we make to one another. I think that we won't always succeed in these promises that we make, and the promises we make are affirmed best in those 7 principles that we all kind of pay attention to. But one of the things that is important about those promises that we make is that we promise that when we fail, that we begin again. That we begin again in love. That's why you can't be a UU by yourself. And why this gathering is so crucial. That your fellowships, wherever they are, however small, are so important. The very nature of covenant implies more than one person. If you're making a promise, you have to make a promise to somebody. And we are rooted in promise. So we can't be UUs by ourselves. We need others to support us and cheer us in our journeys of faith. And they need us. So good UUs affirm the promises that bring us together. Good UUs know, second, that Unitarian Universalists don't get to believe everything that they want to. Or anything that they want to. We know that. It's one of those malicious rumors that got started because we are open and affirming around so many things. And people think because our minds are open, our brains fell out. So they think it doesn't matter what we believe. And you've probably met people who think, oh yeah, you those people who believe anything you want to believe. And we know that's not true. And we have to remember that it's not true. And we have to remember that our third principle, that idea about the free and responsible search for truth and meaning, really is one of those things that can guide and strengthen us. That we can expect our spiritual lives to evolve if we pay attention to that. When I joined Community Church in 1985, I was an agnostic who would cringe anytime somebody said the word God. But I spent time in a community of people, all of whom were on a spiritual journey. Even though we were not necessarily going to end up in the same place, we knew we were on this journey together. So I talked and I listened and I read. I investigated. I took some things in. I threw some things out. I felt that my search was responsible. And so I stand before you today, a theist, a follower of Jesus, an admirer of Buddhism. And in 5 years, I may be somewhere else. Because we are free to do that. As a minister, it's my privilege to walk with people who make those choices and those changes in their lives. and we are strengthened by them. But none of us got to the place we're at by just saying, oh yeah, okay, this sounds good, I think I'll believe that. That's not how our journey is. And so for our own sake and for the sake of others who might wish to join us on that journey, it's important that we know how to tell people that we don't just get to believe anything. It's too important. We don't get to believe anything. We don't get to behave any way we want to. Even when we're faced with people who are scornful and dismissive and rude and horrible about our own faith, or about who we are and what we believe politically. We act as the religious people we are. We don't disrespect them, and we don't allow them to disrespect us. We open ourselves to dialogue, but we understand when perhaps the dialogue needs to be at the end. We don't try to proselytize, but we do try to witness, to be an example of what faithful life is like. Good UUs have tools. We know how to use them. We're the people who use our heads as well as our hearts. We believe in the power of Scripture to inspire and illuminate parts of our lives without taking them literally. We believe in the power of our own lived experience. It's valid, it's important to us. It's what informs our faith and helps us to grow. We're willing to add what we've experienced ourselves to the stories of other cultures and other times and other places to build for ourselves a spiritual foundation that can withhold or that can withstand the kinds of pressure that we're going to face. We embrace all these different ways of knowing so that we can be faithful people. We know that science and religion is not in conflict. They do not have to be in conflict. We're not afraid of medical advances, and we're not afraid of bedside prayers. We're not afraid of the evolutionary process, and we're not afraid of the stories of the world's creation from many cultures. We love and rejoice and are grounded in the beauty of our earthly home. And we use all the knowledge and the skill and the research available to protect that home and this planet for ourselves and for our kids. Science at its best tries to explain how things work the way that they work. Religion at its best tries to explain why things work the way that they work. And good UUs know that most human beings need both explanations. We need both kinds of knowledge to live full lives. I think good UUs know who their enemies are. I do. I know that a lot of us are so romantic about religion and we think that we need to love everybody because we do place love very close to the center of our lives and our practice. But I also think that people of liberal faith have a responsibility to identify those ideals that degrade human life and human flourishing, and to struggle against them with all the power that we have. The affirmation of our first principle, the affirmation of an inherent worth and dignity that every person possesses, I think calls us to a corresponding condemnation of the forces that threaten that worth and dignity. Because that worth and dignity is not always available to every person and is often under siege. I think that good UUs know how to determine extremism and fundamentalism when they see it, and they respond to it with a combination of love and relentless confrontation. That we speak to it as we see it consistently, that we act in ways that allow us to confront it. And that will depend on all kinds of things, all kinds of circumstances, all kinds of places. When I go back home, I'm back in the flow of what we call the Moral Monday New York City activities, where each Monday we witness around a certain event or issue in solidarity with other groups. So that faith communities like Unitarian Universalists and Episcopalians and rabbis in the Jewish tradition and Muslim imams and people from the Zendo down the street and all these other folks can witness to what we know is wrong about life as we are experiencing it in New York right now. To not be silent and to encourage others to join us in breaking that silence. Because good UUs know that the things that unite us are stronger and more important than the things that divide us. In the 21st century, we walk all these tightropes. Tightropes of identity around race and gender and class and neighborhood and lots of other things that hold real meaning for us. I am an African American woman. That is important to me. That identity, that history, that struggle, that culture, all those things matter to me. But that's not all that I am. In the long run, in eternal time, none of the labels that we wear matter as much as the label human being. And despite what the culture, wherever we are, teaches us, we're not cogs in the wheel of capitalism. We're not political parties. We're not wedge issues in the great cultural wars of our time. We aren't symbols. We're human beings who need meaning in our lives and purpose in our lives and love in our lives, who need to be seen and known, and who's known, and we struggle to be seen and known every day of our lives. That is what's central to our lives together. Good UUs know that. Good UUs also understand the profound power of love. We can rely on our Universalist history to help lead us toward a bedrock belief in a loving God, rooted in that historic difference between Universalism and other mainstream faiths, was that a loving God would never be totaling up all our failures and our missteps and all the things that are awful about us so that we could all go to hell and suffer forever. In our classical formulation of Universalism, that was never true. Our own Universalist prophet, Clarence Russell Skinner, who was probably the most important Universalist of the 20th century, wrote a book called The Social Implications of Universalism, and he said something that I held close to my heart in all my years of ministry. The Universalist idea of God is that of a universal, impartial, immanent spirit whose nature is love. It is the largest thought the world has ever known. It is the most revolutionary doctrine ever proclaimed. It is the most expansive hope ever dreamed. Good UUs root themselves in this expansive hope, knowing that there is always the chance that the person who is our enemy today could be a friend tomorrow. We live in that hope. We function in that hope. Good UUs know that revelation is not sealed. We who are awake and alive understand that the possibility exists at any moment for us to be transformed by an encounter or changed by a conversation or led into a deeper understanding of our own lives in ways we did not expect. James Luther Adams, who I talked to you about earlier today, had an essay called Guiding Principles for a Free Faith. It's another document that I reread from time to time. And he says this: we cannot properly place our confidence in our own creations. We must depend upon a transforming reality.